once again, little picture. Another scuba diver. Thank you very much. The scuba diver is here. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'll re-invite everyone on the stage. Oh, everyone. The three speakers. including myself. We could fit everyone, actually. And we go for the Q&A. We don't have a moderator today. It's a small session. So if you do want to ask questions, feel free to ask questions to our speakers. So yeah, feel free to raise your hand or speak whatever is convenient. Yeah.
That's a bit unrelated, but Jonathan, with that Grosjean nurse ChatGPT image, did you scrub metadata from the image before when you asked ChatGPT what it was? Because I've done that in the past, and I noticed the cheeky thing was to use metadata and file names half the time.
Really?
Yeah, so if the file name had green-shark.jpg, so you gotta be real careful with these things.
I think the name of the file name just had shark, so maybe it did prime it to look in that right area. Didn't think of it as a cat. Yeah.
How about the leveling? Was it automatic level for the name, or it was a manual?
For the name.
Leveling the data, because I see that there is some computer vision techniques to automatically detecting which fish it is. So who did this leveling?
Who did the labeling? So in the example with the Australian Institute of Marine Science, they, through their prior surveys, had labeled some of their data, right? And so what they did was, and they actually really only have point labels, because what they would do is say, this is the head of the fish, this is the tail of the fish. And so they had those 2 point labels, and they had species for each one of them. And so they had in historical data, they had, created some crops with some assumptions around those 2 points. And that's what they used to generate their initial training data set. But there are, that would only work for historical data. But if they want to survey new areas of the ocean that have new species, they would have to label, basically. So you still have to kind of solve, part of that labeling challenge. Does that answer your question around labeling? Yeah, that's what you want to know.
I just want to ask, like in your presentation, when you said you have, your team has developed the models to do certain activities. So, what is the issue that you're facing, and because if the models are working pretty much, then what exactly real-time issues that you're facing or trying to address through different kinds of model creation, or what issues you're facing right now?
I think, in some of those examples you saw above, there's just this large variation of what's out there. And so typically organizations go, well, we'll pick some use case and start there. But inevitably you kind of have to solve, how do you solve these additional ones? And often they'll say, you know what, we don't really have enough money to solve these additional ones that, in terms of how we had done it previously. So it is trying to tackle that long tail that is reasonably challenging. And often I find that the actual most challenging bit isn't probably the algorithmic side, because models are pretty good and arguably reasonably efficient. The bottleneck has always been on getting enough examples. Whether you're collecting the data, you have to go and send the boats out there. They're like, well, that's expensive. Oh, then we have to get people to label it. Oh, well, that's also expensive. Can we do it any cheaper, please? Yeah.
So, sorry. My question, probably 2 questions. The first one is about the term that you call enterprise perception system.
Yeah.
Kind of similar to something that I heard a little while ago about digital transformation.
Digital transformation.
Yeah. So kind of similar, but here I guess it's integrating AI into the workflow process or whatever you do to get things done using AI. So when you say perception, looking at computer vision, things that you're doing, what if a person is interested in text, for instance, doing text, how would you call it? Will a person be different first?
No, we do text work for some customers as well, and we still collect perception tasks because often you might be scanning 100,000 documents, and you're looking for some key entities or key events, key things, and it's still very much in our view like a perception task because like the outcome you want is some kind of perception what's going out there. And I think where it maybe differs from some of the stuff that Paul does on the robot level, like that's all we're primarily interested in the organizational level, like whether it's done through Paul's robots or just sending a person out there. You want to perceive as an organization or perceive as a team.
Now, my last question related to what you presented, like the actual trend of the need that people will have to cater for people who will be able to do these kind of jobs. So, what do you think from your person, like, what do you think that organization has to do to be able to implement that kind of vision of enterprise perception system such that they're ready to kind of take advantage of whatever is being done now so that they can get things done?
You wanted to ask the other guys?
Yeah.
I've already done a bit of talk the last few minutes, so I'm happy.
He presented kind of data at the beginning saying that we need more AI people. So that's why I'm asking the question, like, what do you think organizations are missing or need to do so that they prepare themselves for this kind of enterprise perception system to make it happen?
My problem that I had was I tried to partner with a big organization which is called Water International. They've got 1.2 million people available in the field, like living next to all the rivers and in all developing countries. And I tried to convince them to take one picture of pollution each to build my database that I needed. And I ran into the issue that most of them, they didn't know how to take a picture. So that was my first challenge, and then convincing them to do that was also pretty hard. I'm still trying to see whether we could work between large organizations like this to collect data for us, so citizen science opportunities. But sometimes just working with traditional owners, even if there are not many of them, can be a challenge in itself because the data that you're acquiring, you might not own that data, you might need to live with the traditional owners. That means that you're doing all the work, but you can't tell anyone about it because the data is going to not be shareable. So all of those challenges are currently impeding the way moving forward, but still trying to find ways to work with large organizations who can do the groundwork for us rather than sending paid people to actually do it.
The comment I had, when sort of platypus was very much a hobby and we were running around mapping lakes and mines and different things like that, we really found it hard to get organizations to work out how to use the data. On a very one-off basis they could. And working with a lot of drone companies, they find the same things, that the sorts of models that drones can give them of mines or of dams or so on, they get the intuition, but managing the data is a real challenge. And I remember checking out Silver Cloud's website when I first saw Jonathan's name, and some of the stuff I think is really clever. Finding which transformer or something is on a power line and being able to list those, where there's a really clear use case. When they could say, look, I need to know how many of, I don't know what the thing was, but these I need to replace in my network. But when we got to water, they'd sort of say, we know we need to understand more about our lakes and rivers. Go and collect data for us. And then we would collect data, we did big collection down at Exxon Mobil at their impoundment ponds. And then they looked at all the data and said, thanks. We have no idea what to do next. Can you tell us what to do? I don't know what to do next. We've told you everything that's going on in this impoundment pond. And they said, okay, thanks, have a nice day. And you never worked with Exxon again. And I don't think anyone was upset. It was just, they didn't know what to do with it. So stuff like this, I think, is a step. I'd be really curious, to come back, how much AIMday uses this stuff. I think it's nice. if they now know where all the fish are, can they actually use that? Are they any better at using it, given that they've got a whole system? Because we're running a whole bunch of clients that just don't know how to take that next step, and that's a problem.
I would say, I don't know, you probably know more about the AIM situation.
Not on that specific topic because I work on a separate project, but I must say that in every organization that I work with as a consultant, driving change is actually a problem. So you arrive as a consultant to tell them what they need to change to make it work, and they will work against you in every possible way. And at the end of the day, they give you the paycheck, and you're like, thank you very much, thank you for coming, and nothing has changed. So the whole concept of working as a consultant is the more it changes, the more it stays the same. That's so rare.
Yeah, I guess I agree with the this sentiment that one of the missing things is people that actually understand, I guess, the technologies and these changes so that they can communicate effectively and drive that change. And it's hard, right? Like, even when you have people that do understand, change is difficult just due to the natural resistance that people have to change. And then you have also lots of people out there that just don't know. So how can we even expect them to begin a change, right? So it's probably no surprise that not a lot happens. And I guess on Paul's comment, when you do start to pick up an opportunity, they don't even know what to do with the data. And that's actually what happened in the electricity utility case, right? So we began looking at the assets, and when we started, we just said we'll look for everything. Every single asset we'll try and label, we'll look for every single kind of different condition, we'll have an incredibly large taxonomy. And so part of what we built in the product was a very flexible taxonomic system so that we could handle those kinds of use cases. But ultimately what they use it to today, because they've been having it in production for the last 5 years, is they just want to know when to send a truck out to fix it. So ultimately we went wide with a large taxonomy, but now ultimately it's just like one attribute that they truly care about, that they just want to know, right? Because that then drives the action that the business actually needs to take, right? And everything else is kind of fluff. So that kind of sentiment, it's like, what am I going to do with all this extra knowledge? It doesn't drive a day-to-day decision I need to make. So,
and it's funny because you're saying an industry that's fairly narrow to start with, electricity transmission, and then you ended up here. The rest of us are talking about starting with ocean, which is broader. If you took 5 years to get down to a narrow use case, how long is it going to take us? It might be a while.
We've got a couple of more questions here, so
Yeah, I was just wondering, because it sounds like a lot of the problems you're facing with new data are related to labeling, which is a problem unique to supervised learning methods, right? Have you looked at unsupervised methods at all? Or?
Yeah. So we definitely do take unsupervised methods. I think my personal feeling is you always have a minimum that you need to just evaluate.
Even like you want to see what representation.
Yeah, that's right. There's just something, even like to try and clear that minimum bar for some reasons, people don't seem to have enough money for it. Let me put it that way, right? And I think that's partly going to be the challenge in the conservation space is, maybe money is maybe it's more of a coordination. Yeah, coordination, funding problem maybe. Yeah, to try and
red tape.
to get enough to construct something that people can use, like machine engineers, like human learning engineers, like maybe yourself, can take this and just know, well, if I do develop something, does it work? You're just answering that question. Yeah.
There was one more question here.
I'm interested in your thoughts on data integrations. One of the biggest problems with ecological data is that it's incredibly fragmented, right? Sometimes it's actually even there, we regenerate it. And we're now generating with methods that you were talking about, exponential rates of data essentially, which also means that we're exacerbating the problem at an exponential rate, right? So unless we're building integration in some form in right from the start, and I must say, talk was fascinating, but I'm getting a little bit worried when I hear about an enterprise, but unavoidable, I acknowledge that, but about an enterprise perspective, because it actually means fencing off data usually, right? So what's your take on that? Or are we just hoping that ChatGPT in the end solves the problem for us?
It translates for everyone into every language. Is it for me or for the others? Or?
You can answer that one.
I think there are efforts to try and develop a global taxonomy, but I don't know, say in the ecological world, whether it's possible. I've seen like the taxonomy that AIM's was using for like the Broad Survey. Like I can't remember the term of it. It was like there's some common taxonomy that they use. I guess maybe because it's scientific, you can actually lean on that. Working in, say, the utility space, we've noticed that almost every organization has a way of understanding the world, right? And because their processes, the way they drive, like their documentation, their training of people, the language that they use, almost like it becomes very difficult to kind of agree, right? So I think, working with like a large electricity distributor that we're trying to merge two state distributions into one. We believe the CEO got sacked because of the incredible amount of cost. The SAP system, was costing their business, and I think a large part of that was because the two sub-distributors just could not talk the same language. So no matter how much money you threw at it, fundamentally you could not really try and construct a unified view. So I don't know enough about your domain around ecology, whether it suffers from the same kind of like language challenges, or there is a common language. Then I agree with you. Then if there is one, maybe it is just trying to get each organisation to adopt that global taxonomy for sharing of data, for sharing of
There are actually developments for global taxonomies and so on, GBIF standard and whatnot. I think the problematic point actually, or one of the many problematic points is your sentence just had a just in there, right? It's just to get the organizations to actually use those standards. I'm not sure about that just in there.
Once again, people challenges.
It does feel we come back to the original topic that we started with, which is technology is great. We can solve a lot of problems. But when it comes to people, when it comes to communication, that's where usually the problem starts. And we sort of develop the technology, but if we don't have a plan to roll it out, to get users to go and take the next step, the technology doesn't advance any further and we get stuck. So that's probably something we've all experienced so far, and I think that's a common trait between all presentations today. Yeah. Is there any other question? Yep.
I think I have one for you, Paul. I think looking at your picture with all those vessels at sea, do you see any risk in kind of cluttering our oceans? I mean, the ocean is huge, but we also thought space was huge, and we have a big problem now with satellite debris. One storm, and then you have 100,000 shipwrecks.
It goes to emaps.
It goes to microplastics, right?
It's carbon fiber. It's plausible, I guess. I think the ocean is really big. The density that it takes to actually create clutter. I think you're not gonna do it beyond what it's expensive still to run these sorts of things. You're not gonna do it when you're sort of just cluttering up the environment. It is different to space. I mean, nothing's bumped into each other in space, and the reason you worry about it is that knock-on effect when two satellites do break up, they'll take out 12 others, or 100 others, but that's not going to happen with two USVs. They can eventually, knock into each other. I just don't. The number of little drones that are up in the air at the moment is 100 times what we're going to get to any time in the near future, and they're doing that above Melbourne, and you still don't notice it. We're going to do it out across the whole Pacific. I don't think so. But to sort of comment on that and this data thing as well, one of the ways that we've ended up doing it, and part of the reason we sort of moved back to defense applications for USVs is to find people with money and collect stuff for free, right? So we were talking about this earlier. You know, when that fleet is out there, we will collect environmental data. When we're looking for illegal fishermen or whatever it is, we will be collecting a large amount of environmental data. Suddenly, a database may become available for free that is useful, and that then gets used. And then you sort of go, well, actually, that is useful data. Let's go collect it in this other place where I didn't have illegal fishing. So that's sort of the way we go, because it's the same sort of thing. You know, lots of, you mentioned about fragmented and, you know, bits and pieces data. So many organisations say that, but maybe there's just other ways of doing it. Maybe once we've got these fleets out there continuously, we do start to get databases that become useful and fill some of these gaps.
I'd like to rebound on the clutter, the ocean question. There are different ways the ocean deal with the problem. One way is everything you put in the ocean, there is a high chance it comes back onto the beach. And you've seen with the Chinese satellite which fell into the water, they eventually came back to the Australian beach in WA, if I'm correct, a couple of weeks ago. So you find things on the beach quite often, and if you come to Queensland, you will probably notice the beach is pretty cluttered with everything we put in the ocean. If it doesn't come back, it's probably stuck in an eddy, and if it's stuck in an eddy, it breaks down into small particles, to the point where they came out to try to see where all the plastic ended up in the ocean, and when they arrived in the center of the eddy, they couldn't find anything. When they used a microscope, they found that there is actually a large soup of microplastic over there, and it just broken down into small pieces. The third way the ocean deals with the problem, if it doesn't comes back to the beach, if it doesn't stay there, it falls into the ocean. And you would notice that people who dump car batteries into the ocean in specific areas, they actually notice that some fish species, they actually accumulate over there. It creates some kind of a shipwreck. And they found that one of the endangered species were thriving thanks to the car batteries because of the chemical and the acidity in the area created an area for them to thrive. So the question is, should you remove those things out of the water, knowing that anything you put down there may, on the long run, turns out to be whether a dead zone or whether it turns out to be a new ecosystem, and you would see areas where octopuses, they would just start populating areas with beer bottles and things like that. And I've dived in areas which were pristine waters with pollution, and those marine ecosystems, they just populate everything you possibly can find. Unless it's a dead zone, then there is no more oxygen for it to survive.
I guess there's a problem there. So we're considering cluttering the ocean from a purely there's a boat right here perspective, but clutter goes beyond that, right? So these things have electric motors that can be pretty noisy in a certain spectrum. They're probably transmitting data, so within the radio space as well, so they're clogging bandwidth in a pretty remote area. So going back to the satellite perspective, Starlink's great for some people, and all-but radio astronomers, for example, are really struggling because of it. So I guess the question then becomes, how do we limit the impact that these things have on other people's ability to bring out data that might be as valuable, if not more valuable, than what is now being, what is driving out those collection efforts?
I would like just to say one thing. The solutions of today are the problems of tomorrow. A lot of people, they design solutions and then it becomes a problem on the long run. Then we have to solve that.
Yeah.
So I don't take this as a criticism, it's just,
No, it's entirely valid. I mean, I hope we get to the point that becomes a problem, right? Because, not just because it will be commercially very valuable for us, but it'll mean we have a ton of data, right? Like literally, as we said, 10,000 OCS UNSW spin out has got a nice little sailboat doing, like 4 knots around the Cocos Reefs looking for illegal fishermen now and then at the moment. That's the sort of proof of concept. That's fantastic. It's a little sailboat, right? So they've got 3 of them, I think, or 4 of them. Saildrone, another big company, has got 50 doing drug interdiction at the moment. in the Caribbean, sort of spread out over an area. We're still at really, really small numbers, right? There's 7 billion people on Earth, on 30% of the planet, and you know it's cluttered, but there's lots of open space. We're talking maybe 10, 20, 30,000 drones over 70% of the planet. It's just not a significant number. I mean, it's fun to hear it, and I'm not dismissing it. We overwhelmingly, from an AI perspective, look at it the other way, right? We are never getting to the point that we can have saturated coverage of the ocean in any way, shape, or form. We are always going to be sampling a tiny, tiny bit of it because it is enormous compared to any sort of number of vehicles that we can fantasize about putting out. 200,000 or 300,000, you would still sail around and around the Earth multiple times and never see one. Plus, most of us are doing sailboats. You can't hear them. The motors aren't turned on. They're almost silent. Yes, they communicate a couple of megabits per second, but I'm sure the room is communicating 400 times out on our phone right now.
People hit shipping containers all the time,
They do.
accidentally, right? And there are not that many of them floating there. There are many of them floating there, but not that many.
They tend to be a little biased that shipping containers fall off ships that are in shipping channels, so there's a little bit of a bias there, but yeah, absolutely.
I think for the questions, the future questions, we will hold and people can come after the event and ask questions. We'll move on to the next part, which is not going to last too long, but essentially it's the opposite. We are going to ask you a question how you can help us to save oceans using artificial intelligence, and which type of problem, according to you, you think we should be tackling. So the purpose of this part is to collaborate. So how can we collaborate between industry, between academia, between government, between not-for-profits, and work all together onto that big problem, which is the Sustainable Development Goal number 14, and how we're gonna fix, or not necessarily fix, but improve and try to help oceans within the 5 years that we have left, knowing that we haven't tackled that problem.
I mean, it might be naive, but I think you could boil down problems of the ocean as the tragedy of commons, right? It's this awesome, abundant resource where everyone thinks it's awesome and abundant, they can do what they like, which means we're collectively over-extracting. So one of the biggest problems, I think, might just simply be accountability. So right now, it's very easy if I'm sailing around to dump my motor oil overboard or throw trash in the ocean. Who's ever going to know?
Unless you have
if I want to fish whatever I like, I can, because who's ever going to know? So this is the kind of stuff where your work becomes really important. But I guess the bigger problem is, do we want that mass surveillance in our lives? Because much like other dicey topics, it's great until you have to put someone in charge. But I think accountability is lacking in most areas of the human sphere.
What about collaboration? How can we collaborate better between industry, academia, government, and not-for-profits? Like we've seen, there are people, organizations with millions of people, they really want to help. They might not know how to use an app on a smartphone, but they can learn at some point, and we can help get them to collect data for us. We might get government involved as well in order to get smart areas where you can test your solution and validate before you can roll it up all around the reefs. And thanks to the industry or having a support from defense possibly. And we can have academia to come and support. So how do you think academia should be collaborating with us?
Depends on the field, I guess, but like sociology could help you engineer trends. So you're saying that with your photos, for example, the problem is ownership of photos.
Yep.
But if you have check this trash hashtag and everyone's posting their photos, that's public domain now.
Yep.
And now you're getting millions of photos from all across the world of trash on beaches that you can just easily find with the hashtag.
I think it's something that Vic and Paul, you both brought up in that who the conversation is actually with and about. And I think especially with Ocean, something that is impacted, or places that are impacted, is not necessarily major cities directly, it's small island nations, which is something, Vic, that you pointed out as well. And I think that is probably a point of collaboration more so than academia sort of directly. I think there's a lot of academics doing research in those areas where, you know, the effects of climate change happen now. They're not happening in 5 years' time, they're not happening in 2050 when all the projections sort of predict things. They're happening now. And those people are the people where a lot of these sort of sailing boats are going to be around these smaller islands, and it's actually going to impact them much, much earlier than it's going to impact other people. And so we're here to talk about the sort of AI collaboration in academia, but it's almost a social science sort of collaboration that actually becomes quite important because it's impacting them much before it impacts anyone else. And my work personally hasn't necessarily come across any of that kind of collaboration, but that is something that I think maybe specifically Ocean Innovators, or just the research you guys are going through, and maybe you've done it more so than you've spoken about today, because this is obviously for mathematicians and AI, but I feel like that's an area that's quite often underlooked by places like this where we're sort of looking at that 2050 projection, but we're not living in a place where it's impacting us immediately, directly right now.
So potentially we need Monash University to find a PhD student working on social science and solving technical challenges, and how do you match the social impact with the technical solution we found?
Yeah, and I definitely think that social impact actually comes before the technical solution as well.
It's not just the social impact, I think, and I'm really glad that you brought the word trend up. I mean, mostly what happens is actually steered by public opinion. So I'm a data scientist, but over the years I've come to the conclusion that social science and behavior change is actually the far more important component, right? There's no single scenario, if you look at the literature, under which biodiversity in the oceans or anywhere else can be conserved unless you have behavior change, unless you have change of production and consumption. So we can generate all the data that we want, we can do all individual conservation action. It's going to help a little bit, but it's not actually going to do the big thing. And so from my perspective at least, the big thing is actually using these technologies, not exclusively, but also for basically generating trends, right? Changing opinions. So for example, the wind farms in the Hunter are just getting killed by public opinion, right? And we're not using the data, the technologies, our knowledge of behavior change, our knowledge of opinion formation, which is actually a mathematical topic as well, right? To actually try and really counteract that, right? And I think that's an area that, yeah, we should really work on. And I think that's an area where, yeah, collaboration is really important.
What I'm thinking about basically is kind of linking back to what Stuart said, like from a point of view, for instance, since we have this kind of contact with those kind of people, probably you come up with a database of people, social organization or NGO who have some specialty in looking at issues, and then think about how you can implement this enterprise perception system such that they become more knowledgeable about how to use or leverage this kind of technology, and especially I'm thinking about transferability, which is basically both areas like these small islands above Australia where they will be much more impacted by these kind of things. Think about how you can transfer those kind of knowledge to those people and really help them acquire those kind of way of looking at things so that they can be able or be equipped to kind of solve this problem. So from my point of view, you probably have a much more anchor to kind of zero in who is there and who is capable of doing what and what are the needs, and then try to match them. And also, as we said, maybe Monash will be good since they have campuses almost everywhere, especially in the area. They can probably promote or encourage PhD in kind of research. I'm thinking of action research basically to think about how to solve or tackle this issue and also help implement the kind of enterprise facility system so that people who want to do, like you mentioned nature conservation, like where they're trying to use AI. I think you mentioned environmental organization that I know. They're trying to use AI, especially this kind of machine learning technique, but they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to really make it work. So from a point of view, it would be interesting if there is a way to put together some sort of program to kind of be able to kind of initiate some sort of collaboration between different kind of entities to make things happen, especially transfer this knowledge to those less advantaged.
Well, I can take the example of Rotary International. Despite the challenges that I had to convince them to use an app to take a photo, they did manage to convince 1.2 million people to plant 1 tree each. So they ended up planting that year, I think something like 10 million trees around the planet. And that's pretty impressive. So if you could leverage that to different aspects of global warming, which was one of the key aspects, you could plant trees all along rivers and slow down the pollution. You could do a lot of things. So if we manage to collaborate with those organizations, if we do manage to collaborate with scientists and academia to tell us what is the data telling us about what action we should take, such as planting mangroves was one of the key aspects that academia came back and said, okay, it's sequestrating carbon, so we should plant mangrove. We got $2 million raised in the space of a couple of weeks at COP26. So these are the kind of things that this organization can really empower, and you can get a lot of funding to actually solve the biggest problem of the world. But we do need the support of academia to tell us and back us in terms of data. These are the 10 rivers in the world generating 90% of the pollution, and they are all located in Africa and Asia. Can we do something about it?
I think I have an actual idea on how to marry industry and academia a bit without having anyone's time and resources too much. So PhD students at Monash at least have to finish a number of hours in professional development throughout their PhD. I think it's 120 hours or something like that. And the intent of it is to make us more employable at the end, right? What if, as industry partners with that university, you guys could offer X amount of hours for working with us on a problem in our company? That way I don't have to watch 120 hours of videos on outdated timing courses. I get to meet some cool people, do some interesting problems, and as long as my hours get signed off, no one cares. There's hours that would otherwise be spent, so my supervisor doesn't mind. I'd love to get paid, but I imagine I take that deal for free. That means I'm not watching outdated videos, so you know, like
95% of our fieldwork has been done by students. It's actually really interesting, different robotics problem about who field techs are, because professionals don't want to mostly watch robots because they want to build them instead, and students turn out to be perfect because they get a bunch of interesting experience, they get to play with robots. I reckon 95% of our fieldwork has been done by students. That's all we hire. So
doesn't surprise me. It's a cool field. I joined the robotics soccer team for a while.
We actually tried to hire someone for December, because we needed someone to go and sit on the boat for them. So yeah, absolutely, we can do that.
So I was really curious about what you just said, because if I heard you correctly, you said, but we do need academia to tell us essentially where the problem is, right? And that's interesting because I think it's almost the same from inside of academia, right? So people work on all these methods and solutions, whether that is like the kind of stuff you guys are doing, right? AI methods and so on, or whether that is certain models of whatever, the ocean or this or that, right? But very often, and particularly in the technological area, the question, where's actually really the problem that we're trying to solve, is exactly the same from within academia. So
there is a chicken and egg.
Yeah, so that's a bit of a, we probably, both of us probably need the people like NGOs and so on to actually point towards that, right? Yeah. So that's probably, I would think, not the hottest area where we can really generate synergies, I would think. And even if I think about your model of sending PhD students and so on, which is a good idea from both sides, right? But I think it's pretty much the same, right? Because people would come in and apply or work on certain types of methods, solutions, and so on, right? But the kind of problem needs to be there in the first place, in a concrete form, right?
Maybe my comment was not very well thought through, but you do have plenty of solutions, and you do have an idea sometimes on how those solutions can solve bigger issues. Now the question is, how can we communicate that across all the stakeholders in order to match the solution to the problem? And that's probably, when I made that comment, I probably thought, okay, there is a problem, but we need you to tell us what solution you would be bringing to the problem. So you need to find the problem for us, because you want to match that solution to the problem. That's what I sort of tried to get into, but I sort of did myself a little bit with that one. So.
Just one suggestion or idea, sort of along those lines. I forget the Prime Minister before Modi in India. We went across there at one point, and they spent $100 million trying to clean up the Ganga River, right? And everyone looked at it and said, it's exactly the same as it was before. Whose pocket is that $100 million in? And the people we spoke to said, look, this is where we spent it, this is what we did. And the reason, we had some conversations for them before they were voted out, was they said, well, could data have done this for us, right? Could data have said, this is better, this is worse? And I think, as much as we would have taken the contract, there was still an academic rigor missing, right? What they needed was data before and data after. They needed academic models to say, look, you get seasonal changes, you get this, you get that. These are the sorts of things you're fixing. I think there's some good academic work that could have done something there, and potentially, going back to the public perception problem, change the public perception. You spend $100 million, okay, they do swim in the Ganga, but they shouldn't be swimming in that river, and you're not going to fix it with $100 million in 1 year, but it was going in the right direction. But everyone looked at it and said, I still saw a floating pig, so, therefore, someone's just stolen $100 million, stop, and that was the end of the project for a while. I think there's an interesting role that, the independence and rigor of academia can play in that sort of thing, and, the stuff that we do over time as well, right? Of are you making any difference in the world, right? Obviously, the mangroves one is a good example of it, where it came, but it could be the other way. Are these projects really making a difference? Were they the right projects? Is the Ganga being improved? Was there a better thing to do?
I have an interesting story about the pollution in rivers for the Yarra River in Melbourne. I don't know whether you remember when they banned the plastic bag at that time. So we did cleanups around the river and collected data and sorted the data. And before the river, there were a lot of plastic bags. Before they banned the plastic bag, there were a lot of plastic bags in the river. And after the ban, we stopped seeing them only after a few weeks. So they disappeared. And in the next month, we started to see the bigger plastic bags sold by Woolworths, the one you have to purchase. And we saw a lot of those. And the problem shifted from the small plastic bag that you get for free to the heavy one that you pay for. And the difference is Woolworths was making tons of money now, and the problem had shifted to another problem. And to know that its statistics is having researchers to take the time to understand and build those. The timing element is very critical, and you need governance behind to tell the government, yes, we are stepping towards the right direction, but unless you provide another solution which makes things feasible for the people to swap to something sustainable, they are just going to replace the problem by another problem. And we end up to go back to the solutions of today or the problems of tomorrow.
I've got a little example, somewhat related to this garbage and pollution thing. We were talking to a council around their education of people putting the wrong things inside their recycle bins. So as you can imagine, if you put plastic bag, like your rubbish inside a recycle bin, contaminates the recycle bin. So either they have to pay or they have to deal with that contamination in some way. Maybe they just chuck that rubbish anyway. And so they're treating it like an education problem, right? Going back to, you know, how do you take our work and drive an impact out in the world? Because obviously data is insufficient. And so what they're looking to do, because they've put cameras in all the garbage and recycling bin trucks out there now, is to try and understand which houses haven't learned what to put in those bins. And then they have teams of people that effectively go out to those places and have a conversation with those people around, okay, well, maybe you don't understand what actually goes in your blue bins versus your green bins, something like that. Right? Your recycle bins versus your garbage bins, you know, let us help you with that. And I think that's part of, how we go from AI or data science to some kind of, you know.
And that highlights a really interesting point, I think, because the data that you're talking about right now isn't actually the data on what does recycling do, right? It's about how do people recycle. So if we transfer that to this thing, to the ocean problem, right? And one of the questions would be, how do people engage with that topic? How do they think and talk about the ocean? Ultimately, how does that influence voting? Because that's the only thing that really counts, right?
I would like to answer that. If you look at the plastics is the visible part of the iceberg, which is ocean pollution. Okay, you see the plastic, you can feel it, you can touch it, you can see it with your own eyes, and people identify to it. What they don't realize is there are a lot of different types of pollutions in the ocean, which are noise pollution, which are heavy metals, which are like high turbidity and so forth. There are a lot of parameters which are pollution. People only see the plastics, so they are gonna say, oh, it's because people are lazy. The reality is, it's often because whether they don't understand how to recycle, or whether because the systems are not in place to prevent the plastic to fall into the river, which fall into the ocean. So how do you prevent plastics from falling into the rivers? Well, maybe the way that they pick the bin out, if it tips over, for example, it's going to stay there, or it's going to end up in the waterways. So they have ways to pick it up. They have those smart sockets, and the problem is, if it rains, all those smart sockets, they fill out very quickly. Once it's full, they close up. It's an invention from Australia, so it's being recognized all around the world. Once the socket is full, it detaches, and then there is a GPS telling you, oh, it's washed up over there. But everything else which keeps flushing goes straight to the ocean. So the systems right now that we have are not necessarily sufficient to prevent the pollution to get there. So it's not always that the people are lazy, it's erosion erodes the earth, and the wind blows and the pollution gets out because it didn't get, it went to landfill instead of being burnt, or instead of being recycled. So it ends up in the waterways, but it's not because people are always lazy, it's also because the systems that we are doing do not prevent the pollution to get there in the first place. But they always think people are lazy, and they only see the visible, and the money goes to what is visible, and what is invisible, we are not solving the problem right now. So we end up with eating salmon with heavy metal in it, we end up with microplastics because it's invisible, and there is not much we do about it. And does it answer your question?
I'm not sure, because the question is actually, so how do we get to the point where things are done about it, right? And I'm sure data is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. The way that we usually take microplastics, which have actually become a topic that people look at, right? But yeah, I think it's a very complex question. Part of the thing is that people don't look at data. That's the first thing, right? And while during COVID, actually, I think that could perversely, COVID could almost give one hope, right? People actually started to look at plots and things like that, right? And actual data that all went away immediately afterwards. But it was probably the first time that people actually really looked at data and kind of based their thinking on it, right? can we learn something from that? Maybe, maybe not, I'm not quite sure how we use that. But much of what drives what people do is actually not so much data because it's an abstract thing, but if people want to drive things, it's usually they turn data into stories, right? And hey, maybe again, we need ChatGPT. So people get driven by something that's tangible, that's kind of small, where, yeah, my grandmother died because of that, right? That type of thing. Or there's a cuddly little koala and that's falling out of the tree. That type of stuff, right?
Problem
Not numbers.
It takes time for the problems to create issues in our bodies. Now, microplastic is proven to affect the density of bones, including your teeth, including male and women infertility. So all of this is coming. But by 2050, there will be more plastics than fish in the ocean. So it's already sort of too late. We can't wait for the data or for the stories to arrive. We have to use whatever data we have right now, do education, do training, and potentially use those amazing not-for-profit organizations to do that awareness aspect.
Okay, but you don't necessarily have to wait for that to arrive, right? So for example, part of what's happening here at Monash is some people are constructing immersive future scenarios, an immersive landscape, right? And that is of course based on extrapolation, it's based on science and blah, blah, blah. But the effect is you're not presenting, it's based on data, but you're not presenting data. What you're presenting is a horror scenario. What you're presenting is an immersive scenario that people actually go into and kind of experiencing what's happening, right? Or what will be happening. You could do similar things with, that's terrestrial and so on, but you could do similar things, for example, with ocean scenarios.
I'm just concerned about the time. I see that people had a long day. So I'm proposing we land on this. So thank you very much for attending the panel. We've got a special thing before we close up. So if I can get Andrea, do you want to come up as well? I need one more picture. Andrea, I just wanted to thank you for organizing this day. It's been truly amazing, and it's been a pleasure to have all these amazing people to come and try to collaborate and see how we can solve the problems. Thank you.
Thanks for organizing this. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On the behalf of the School of Mathematics, I wanted to thank Andrea and thank you, Vic, for arranging this extra curriculum activity. It's been a long day, as you said, but I think it's been very fruitful, and I look forward to ongoing collaboration. This is what this day is for. So thank you, everyone, for coming here, and I wish you all a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Last time for Afran for also supporting this collaboration between French and Australian, and who supported Ocean Innovators for the past 2 years. Thank you. On this, thank you very much. Oh, that's okay. Merci beaucoup. C'était un plaisir. Ça vous a plu? I live in Melbourne, work in Townsville, so I just go back and forth all the time. Yeah. So you'll find me somewhere in the airport. That's pretty much what it is.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good to meet you. Yeah. Just stay in touch. Work will cross paths. Seems complimentary.
So any other?
Yes, bye.
Hopefully see you early next week.
Yes.
That's right. Your question was really right when I said the problem. The reality is everybody is and that's the problem. My problem is the opposite of those, and we are also
And the solution?
yeah.
Or you can ask.
Did you have a big place like that? So you came back for family reasons? Or?
Yeah. So just like all like that. I just wanted to get do you have a name from the
Went back to the States?
Okay, yeah. Because I left my laptop.
I lived there for a year.
With the guy in the Davis yeah. What's his name?
I need to stop the recording as well.
Should I just press stop?